Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Elevating the Sparks, where we explore the world of Chassidus. Last week we talked about. One second, we just close the door over here. Okay. Last week we talked about Rabbi Nachman of Breslau. We discussed a little bit about his life and learned some of his Torah. And I decided this week that I wasn't ready to move on from Rabbi Nachman. I just wasn't ready to move on. I was hoping to get a Breslover Chassid to come talk to us. I did reach out to someone who's a contact of mine, and they were very willing to participate, but they live in England, which makes them teaching a nighttime shiur a bit unfeasible. So maybe they said maybe they could find someone in Toronto. Maybe that will work out. We'll see. But in the meanwhile, I thought we would do something a bit different. And that is that I thought we could learn together in a different sort of way today. I thought we could learn one of Rabbi Nachman's stories together. Now, what I mean by learn together is really learn together, meaning this is really not meant to be a lecture. This is not me lecturing on a story, giving a discourse on the story. What I would like is for all of us to read the story together. And Rabbi Nachman's stories are not just stories. They hint and allegorize very deep lessons in life and in serving Hashem. And in this one specifically, you'll see that it has a parallel in Likutei Moharan. There's a parallel lesson in Likutei Moharan, which is expressed more frontally in that same, or many of the same ideas are expressed in this story in a literary form. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is share my screen. Simply, these stories are accessible in Sefaria. We're going to use an English translation today. I would be more particular about reading from the Hebrew if we were reading a more classical text. But since it is a story, I think it's most important that we understand it, even if the translation isn't perfect. And I would love it if we could go around the Zoom room and we could have volunteers to read. It's simple English. And Ralph, my friend Ralph, who's now in my top right corner, I would love it if you could start us off. Would you be willing to do that, Ralph? Just give me a thumbs up if you would be. Perfect. Ralph is an amazing reader. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. You should be able to see it now. It's simply Sefaria. Hopefully you can see it pretty clearly. Do we see it pretty clearly? Yeah? No? Tell me if you do or don't. I could make it bigger. You see it? So do you see where it says Tale 9, the clever man, the simple man? Yeah? That's the title of the story, The Clever Man and the Simple Man. So over the course of the story, it's quite long. I don't know if we're going to finish the entire story today. But let's see what we can get. We're going to have to keep track of two different characters, the clever man and the simple man. Pretty straightforward. And these two people and all the different things in the story clearly represent something very profound. And so as we read the story, we have two things we have to do. We have to understand the story, and that shouldn't be too particularly difficult. And we have to think what it's getting at. So without further ado, Ralph, if you could pick up from where it says, once there were two homeowners. This is Sipurei Masiot, Sipor Tet, story number 9.
Once there were two homeowners in a city who had great wealth, large houses, and 2 sons. That is, each of them had a son. The 2 children learned together in the same schoolhouse. One of them was a chacham, clever, smart, sophisticated, wise. And the other was a tam, simple, innocent, artless, wholesome. Not that he was a fool, rather his intellect was simple, without sophistication. The two sons loved each other very much. Even though one was a chacham and the other was Tom, they nevertheless loved each other very much. Came a time when the two householders began to decline. They continued to decline until they lost everything and became destitute, with nothing remaining but their houses. As the sons began to grow up, their fathers told them, "We don't have enough money to pay for you, to sustain you. Do for yourselves what you can."
Okay, pause there for a second. Are you all clear in the first part of the story? Everyone's following? Pretty
Pretty hard
straightforward.
not to be.
Right. But just keep in mind, there's a lot there that we have to think about. So these two fathers, they're not going to appear through the rest of the story. I'm not sure what the two fathers are getting at. And then there's these two sons. One is a chacham, one is a tam. What does that remind you of, by the way? The chacham and the tam? Miriam says Pesach, the four sons, right? We have a chacham and a tam.
Oh,
So now we have two of the sons in this story. They're both sons. Maybe that's why they're sons in the story. I wonder. And they have to go out into the world. And they love each other. That's an interesting part of it. Okay, continue, Ralph. Go for it.
the Tom went and learned shoemaking. The chacham, who was a bar chavana, an astute, discerning person, didn't want to apply himself to such a common trade. He decided he would travel the world and see what he wanted to do. As he was going about the marketplace, he saw a large wagon with 4 horses in harness speeding through. He called out to the merchants, "Where are you from?" They answered him, "From Warsaw." "Where are you going?" "To Warsaw." He asked them, "Perhaps you need workers." They saw that he was astute, motivated, and looked good, so they accepted him. He traveled off with them and served them very well on the way. When they arrived in Warsaw, since he was a bar Havana,
Ralph, that's bar Havana. Havana means understanding. So bar Havana is someone who's very discerning. Just wanted to make sure you understood that.
he
Thank you.
decided, since I'm already in Warsaw, why should I remain with those merchants? Maybe there's a better place than with them. I shall go search and see. As he walked around the marketplace, he began to investigate and inquire about the men who had brought him and whether there would be a better place than with him. They answered that these people who had brought him are honest people, and it's good to be with them. However, it's very difficult to be with them since their business dealings are in very different places. So he went on. He noticed a clothing shop as they were going around in the marketplace with all their customary charm, with their caps and pointy shoes, and the rest of the affectations and flair in their gait and appearance. Since he was so sharp and discerning, this occupation looked very proper, being pleasant and local. So he went to the men who had brought him, gave them his praise and appreciation, but told them that it wasn't comfortable for him to be with them. As for recompense for them having brought him, he had served them on the road. So he went and offered himself to a proprietor. And the way with servants is, at first, one has to be hired for less and do the heavier work. Then later, one advances to better jobs. The proprietor would use him for very hard work, sending him off to nobility, carrying merchandise in the manner of servants, prominently displaying the garments on their extended arms. This work was very hard for him. Sometimes he needed to carry the merchandise to upper floors, and this work was very hard for him. He decided, since he was a philosopher, a discerning person, why do I need this work? Is not the main point the ultimate purpose, to get married and have a living? I don't need to see to that yet. I'll be free for that later in the years to come. Meanwhile, it would be better to travel, visiting countries, feasting my eyes on the world. He went about the marketplace and saw merchants riding on a large wagon. He asked them, "Where are you going?" "To Lagorna." "Would you take me there?" Yes, they took him there. From there, he traveled to Italy, and from there to Spain. Shall I go on?
Yeah, actually, why don't you pause for a second here? Just pause for a second. So clearly this is focusing on the Chacham, right? The wise person. What impression do you get about this wise person so
He's
far?
not very wise.
Okay, well, in what sense? What is his wisdom leading him to do?
Well, he's jumping all over the place without really knowing anything about what each one is all about.
Okay, so you're saying he's rushing to decisions. Why
And
else? Yeah,
he also seems more prideful than wise,
he's a bit prideful. Why do you think he's so prideful, Linda?
because he keeps thinking he's too good for everything, like something, everything's beneath him in a way.
Right. But what leads him to think that? Why does he think he's too good for everything? Is it just arrogance?
Well, it's inexperience for one thing.
Okay.
He's very naive.
Right. Okay. Naivete. But it sounds like what he's saying is, you know what? This seems kind of crass. This seems not meaningful. Why should I engage in all this physical toll if I could find something far more fulfilling, far more befitting of a person like me, who's always searching, right? That's the point. That's what you see from the wise man. The Chacham is always looking for something else.
But it's only for himself.
That's true. Well, right now he's only thinking about himself. That's certainly true. Okay. So does anyone else want to read from where it says, meanwhile? Thank you so much, Rob. That was great. I just figured we should spread the wealth, keep everybody in it. Anyone want to volunteer? Just English. Rose, you want to do it? Rose has got it. Perfect.
Sure, I did this in grade 3.
Oh, you know this one?
No.
Okay. Well, I trust you'll do a great job then. Although we just lost your picture.
That's okay. Meanwhile, many years passed and he became even more knowledgeable on account of having been in many countries.
You can go to by traveling. But no. See that by traveling?
Right. It just says of having been in many countries. See Sefer Hamidot Derech. By traveling, a person becomes discerning, mevin. He decided, now it's time to look at the ultimate purpose. He began to philosophize about what he should do. It seemed to him that he should learn goldsmithery, which is a major occupation, a nice craft entailing great insight and very profitable. And since he was such a bar hana and philosopher, he received the skill and he became quite a great craftsman, even more of an expert than the one who had trained him. Afterwards, he concluded, even though I have such a trade in hand, nonetheless, I do not have enough with this. Today, this is an important profession. Maybe at another time, some other thing will be considered important. So went ahead and placed himself with a gem cutter. And on account of his cleverness, he acquired the skill in a short time. Well, in a quarter year. Then he philosophically decided, even though I have two trades in hand, who knows, perhaps neither of these will remain important. It would be better for me to learn a craft that will always be important. Probing with his insight and philosophy, he determined to learn medicine, which is always needed and always esteemed. Now, the way of learning medicine is to first learn Latin, the language and its writing, as well as the wisdom of sophistry. And this too, on account of his brilliant mind, he mastered in a short time, a quarter year. And he became a big doctor, a philosopher, an expert in all fields of wisdom.
Good. Let's hold there for a second. Okay, so that's our first introduction to the wise, the chacham. So what, let's say, what insight is with this picture of the chacham and all his pursuits? What social commentary is Rabbi Nachman giving here? What is he talking about?
He's talking about focus and mindfulness and living in the present, as opposed to always thinking about the future and neglecting the importance of the present.
Okay, that's certainly one message, right? There's a certain clear criticism of oh, but maybe this isn't good enough. What if this happens? What if goldsmithery doesn't cut it one day? I should learn another trade and another trade. Okay, let's think about the disciplines themselves here, right? So this chacham is learning, this wise person, we're going to say quote unquote, as Ralph said, he doesn't necessarily seem to be wise. And maybe part of the commentary here is what is true wisdom? What does it really mean to be wise?
He's only trying to enhance himself. And I don't see what he's giving back.
Right? So he's certainly selfish. But part of this is obviously maybe wisdom isn't only the ability to learn many crafts or to memorize many different disciplines. There's a deeper form of wisdom that's probably far more useful. What about the commentary on the disciplines themselves? Meaning this person is studying what he starts off with being a merchant and then a clothing designer and then
he's going right up the ladder.
He keeps going up. But what does it say about each of these disciplines, though?
He hasn't really made money with any of them. He's learned.
Right.
We don't know. We don't know that. We aren't told that.
We are told that because as soon as he masters a craft, he goes and jumps onto something else. So there's no time for him to have earned a living. He knows the craft, but he doesn't know the business side. He doesn't know how to engage with customers or
Right, okay.
Or the practical side. I mean, he's really excellent on the intellectual side. There is zero practical acumen that he's getting.
Right. So I think what you're saying, Rose, I think that's very on, is that there's a certain critique here of, I guess, theoretical wisdom as opposed to practical wisdom. That
Well,
you could have a lot of theoretical wisdom, but if that doesn't translate into practical wisdom, then what is it really worth?
You're talking about
this one's like
human wisdom about people.
Doesn't he?
And human wisdom, how to deal with people, 100%, right? Yeah. So there's and I think we can sort of relate to this, can't we? Can we relate to certain people who, are always focus on the next position and the next position and the next position, and they're always just focused on only climbing the social ladder, climbing that hierarchy, getting higher and higher and higher. And to what end? To what end? And what satisfaction does it actually bring them? And what fulfillment and meaning does it actually give them? And so clearly it's a caricature. There's no doubt about that. But I think there is a certain point he's making here about a few things, about wisdom, about the study and pursuit of wisdom, and how valuable that is, or how it is not necessarily always so valuable. And also about the pursuit of, I guess you could say, self, the pursuit of wealth, and trying to constantly invest in one's career and where that might lead. Now, nothing bad has really quite happened yet. We're at the beginning of the story, but I think there are already a number of points to make there. Yes,
there isn't a single other person that he has related to and engaged with.
Not yet, no. Although he did love the simple person. Remember that. Which is
that
interesting.
was the beginning. The whole story is predicated on the fact that neither parent could sustain these sons in the future.
Right.
The Tom went out, learned a trade, and engaged in it. The Bar Havana engaged in learning, but not in practicing, and he does not have operational skills. He has zero operational skills, and he has zero money management skills.
So this also, Rosa, you're doing great, but I do want to go a little on, but I think you're making another really important critique, which is, what is the purpose of learning? And that's a really important critique that Rabbi Nachman, I think, is making. There's a huge emphasis in Judaism on Torah learning, on Limud Torah and learning generally and acquiring wisdom. But what is the ultimate end of that? And I think Rabbi Nachman here is making a very sharp critique against learning just for the sake of knowing. That if your knowledge doesn't translate into bettering you practically as a person, then you're missing the boat, right? Like, that's clearly part of the message here. Okay, let's move on. Let's learn about the clever man. Does anybody else want to pick it up? We can keep going around back and forth. Anybody else want to read about the clever man? The clever man afflicted the simple man joyful. Charlie, you want to read? You help us out, Charlie? I just while we're getting, I did want to mention, I should have mentioned it before, that tonight's class has been sponsored by Mindy Green very generously. So thank you so much, Mindy. So Charlie, you want to pick it up? Doesn't look like a, yeah?
Oh, I was muted.
There you go. You start from after this, after all this.
After all this, the world began to seem in his eyes as nil. For due to his genius, and since he was such a great craftsman, and so wise, and such a doctor, every person in the world was like nil to him. He decided that he would now accomplish the purpose and take a wife. He opined to himself, if I marry here, who will know what has become of me? Let me rather go back home, so that people will see what has become of me. I left as a young boy, and now I have come to such greatness. And he picked up and traveled home, experiencing great afflictions on the way. For on account of his sophistication, he didn't have anything in common with people about which to converse.
That is a sharp critique. No, sorry. Go for it.
He was so worldly and refined that he found no lodging up to his standards, and so he felt constantly afflicted.
It's a sharp critique, no? Such a sharp critique there. He was so refined and so wise, he had nothing to talk to about with anybody. And that really does target a certain perspective. And for those of you, and I think this is intentional, And as we go on, maybe we'll think a bit about the history and the time period Rabbi Nachman's writing in, right? Because think, Rabbi Nachman lived in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So there's a lot happening in the world when Rabbi Nachman is...
Well, it was a world divided socially, nobility and commoners.
Right. And it's also right about the beginning of the Enlightenment.
Right.
And all of these revolutionary ideas, and Jews are now just beginning to have the chance to pursue secular wisdom, etc., and to become sophisticated and knowledgeable. But there's also clearly a critique here against a certain conception of the philosopher. And there's a certain perspective out there, and you might say you could associate this to some degree with the Rambam, the Maimonidean perspective, or those are the Greek philosophers, certain perspective of, ultimately the most important thing is to just think, and the most important thing is to just study and to learn. And you know what? When you're around people who talk about all sorts of mundane, practical things, it's kind of hard to do that. We get distracted, we get bogged down with silly things. And so maybe it would be better to sort of be alone, and so that we can be to ourselves, alone with our thoughts and our studies and our thinking, and so that all the common people wouldn't bother us. There is a certain type of thinking. And the truth is, those of you who learned Rambam with me a little bit, a number of months ago, the Rambam does indeed say that a person should try to find a lot of time to themselves so that they won't be distracted by the silly conversations of others. So to me, this is a very sharp critique of that. And what's the critique? Why is it so bad in Rabbi Nachman's eyes to just say, you know what, I don't want to, I'm too sophisticated and wise to deal with such silly conversation? What's the biting critique of that perspective?
You isolate yourself.
Yes.
Right.
And you're not doing what you can to make the world a better place.
Right. Ralph is always very focused on making the world a better place. That's always going to be his critique. So I do appreciate that. Thank you, Ralph. And that inspires me. But on a very simple level, Rose says you isolate yourself. You know what else? It's hard to be happy. It's hard to be happy. The critique here is that this fellow, the wise, the clever man, is afflicted on his journey back to his home simply because he has no contacts. He has no capability of doing simple things like asking people for lodging or accepting lodging or for transportation, because these things are just beneath him. And this leads him to suffer totally unnecessarily, right? There's a very clear biting critique here. So now let's get back to the simple man. Go for it.
Rabbi, just one thing here.
Yeah.
This all reminds me a bit of Kohelet.
Oh, yeah.
Kohelet was a wise person, right? And yet nothing seemed to make him happy.
Very apt comparison. Right on the money. I will tell you, I already see we're not going to finish the whole story. Maybe I'll summarize it for you at the end. Maybe. I don't think I want to do that though. If we run out of time. But I will say that in the parallel piece to the story, in Likutei Moharan, he quotes the end of Kohelet. What's the end of Kohelet? Anybody know?
Yerei Shamayim is the only thing.
Davar hakol nishma, et Elokim yirav et mitzvosav shemor ki zeh kol adam. In the end of the day, when everything is heard, ultimately, our job is to fear God and keep his mitzvot, because that is all of humanity. That after Kohelet essentially has all the experiences and wealth and wisdom and knowledge, etc. And Kohelet's obviously a very complicated work that I'm summarizing in a couple of seconds here. What is his ultimate message? In the end of the day, it's about It's about fear of God and keeping his mitzvot. So that's a very apt description. Thank you so much, Charlie, for that. Okay, go for it. For now.
Now, let us set aside the story of the clever man and we will begin to tell the story of the simple man. The simple man learned shoemaking, and since he was a simple person, he had to study the trade a great deal until he got it. And even then, he did not have complete expertise in the craft. He took a wife and he sustained himself from his work. And since he was a simple person and was not such an expert, therefore his livelihood came with a great deal of pressing and was very limited.
Slow.
He didn't even have time to eat because he always had to work
I read
due to his inability to be more proficient in his craft. Only while he was working, when he had inserted the nail and pulled through the cobbler's thread, only then would he take a bite of a piece of bread and eat. The simple man's customary behavior was to be always very joyful. He was constantly full only of happiness, and he had all the foods, all the drinks, and all the clothing. He would say to his wife, "My wife, give me to eat," and she would give him a piece of bread, and he ate. Then he would say, "Give me the sauce with buckwheat groats," and she would cut him off another slice of bread, and he ate. And he would praise and say, "How very good and nice is this sauce." Similarly, he would order himself served meat and other delicacies. And for each dish, she would give him a slice of bread from which he would have great pleasure and give great praise. How well prepared this is, as if he had actually eaten that very dish, where he would really and truly feel in the bread that he ate the taste of all the foods he wanted on account of his great timimut,
Tom.
the quality of being Tom, and his immense joy.
Okay, hold on there for a second. So we all caught about what he did when he was eating, right?
He wasn't given it at all, just bread.
He was given bread, and then what he would say, "Oh, gewaldige steak, thank you so much. This is the best steak ever." That seems a little bit silly. But what does that remind you of? What teaching does that remind you of? What medrash? Story in the Torah?
The manna.
The man. And it's a very interesting take on the story, right? The man was the lechem min hashamayim, the bread from heaven that the Jewish people were fed in the desert, in the midbar, right? That's what the Torah tells us. They ate man. Now the Torah actually ascribes a certain taste to the man. It says tamok etzapichet bidvash, but Chazal have a specific teaching that the man tasted like anything that you wanted, right? That's what Chazal say. It's based on an inference from the pasuk. So I always thought that was literal. Like I always thought that really meant it could magically morph into whatever sort of food you wanted. Maybe Rabbi Nachman is suggesting something a little bit different here, right? You see that?
Yeah.
The point wasn't, and man is often referred to as a sort of spiritual food, in that maybe it wasn't necessarily how the man tasted, but it was more about the mindset the Jews had while they were eating it, while they were there in the desert with nothing, and the sort of spiritual quality of the food and the perspective they had on the purpose of eating and the joy they had from the fact that God was miraculously feeding them in heaven. The point being that it's not about the taste per se, but it's about the enjoyment and satisfaction that you get from it. And Chazal do say, Lo nitna haTorah ela la'ochlei haman, that the Torah was only given to those who eat man, And maybe this is what Rabbi Nachman's getting at, that those who are satisfied, really deeply satisfied and happy and fulfilled with what they have. That's a really, again, a really beautiful piece of commentary just based on this silly story. And he continues here. And I think it's a bit humorous if you think about it, right? You can picture this, no? You can picture this simple person. You probably have an image of this person in your mind if you think about it. Maybe even someone in your life who's sort of like this. Continue, please, Charles.
And most people in the desert eating the man were simple people.
Right? Right? I hear you.
I would think so, right? I would think so. I mean, it was Moses teaching them, and they were all simple.
Could be.
And similarly, he would say, my wife gave me a drink of beer. She would give him water, and he would praise, how nice is this beer? And then he would summon, give me mead. She gave him water, and he would praise it the same way. Give me wine or other drink. She gave him water, and he would delight in and praise the drink as if he really drank wine, etc. So, too with clothing. He and his wife shared one peltz. That's the Yiddish word for a coat, an unfinished piece of fur used as a coat. He would say, my wife, give me the peltz. When he needed it, namely to go to the market, she would give him the peltz. When he needed a tulip, fancy overcoat with fine fur on the inside, which rolls over onto the collar, to go out socially, he would say, my wife, give me the tulip. And she would give him the peltz. He would take great delight in it and praise, what a beautiful tulip this is. When he needed a kaftan, long suit coat, for instance, to go to synagogue, he would summon and say, my wife, give me the kaftan. And she would give him the peltz. He would praise and say, how nice and beautiful is this kaftan. And so too, when he needed to don a yuppah, a long silk robe worn for formal occasions, she would also give him the peltz. And he would also give praise and delight. How beautiful and nice is this yuppah? And the like. Thus he was fully only of joy and delight constantly. When he would finish a shoe, and the shoe probably had 3 corners, it was not symmetrical. Since he did not have complete proficiency in his craft, he would take the shoe in his hand and praise it highly. And he would take great pleasure from it and would say, my wife, how beautiful and wonderful is this shoe? How sweet it is. What a honey, what a sugary shoe this is. She would ask him, if this is so, why do other shoemakers take 3 gulden of a pair of shoes, and you take only a half thaler, 1.5
Taller.
Taller? Okay.
Taller, yeah.
Taller. He replied, what's that to me? That's the other person's business, and this is my business. And besides, why do we have to talk about other people? Let's just start calculating how much I earn with the shoe from hand to hand, from hand to hand to hand of the customer, i.e., considering all factors in the process of making and selling the shoe. The leather costs me this much, tar and thread costs this much, and filling between the skins this much, and likely other items this much. Comes out that I profit 10 groschen from hand to hand. And with such a profit from hand to hand, what is there to be concerned about? So He was only happy and cheerful at all times, but to the world, he was a laughing stock. In him, they had just what they wanted, someone to mock however they pleased, for he seemed like a lunatic. People would come and start speaking with him, intending to make fun and mock. And the simple man would say to them, just without mockery, and as soon as they answered him, no kidding, he listened to them and started talking with them, for he did not want to further suspect witticism. That perhaps this itself, the reply, is mockery, for he was a tam, a tam, simple. But when he would see that their intentions was indeed to ridicule, he would say, so what if you are more clever than me? Would you not then be the real fool? For what do I amount to? So if you'll be more clever than me, you'll still be a fool. All this were the usual ways of the simple man. Now we will return to the original subject, the clever man.
Okay, let's pause there for a moment. Okay, I think that was a pretty masterful description of the clever man. I think you get a really great picture of the sort of person he was. You can picture this is in a movie. Like it's that clear to me. But what's the point he's making about the clever man? What lessons are we meant to draw from the simple man, rather?
Rabbi, can I just say something? Wouldn't the Rambam have a problem with this tam? Because the Rambam don't go to the extremes. Don't go to the extremes, and he's going to the extreme.
Well, they're both an extreme.
For sure. I will tell you.
This guy is ridiculous.
I will tell you, he is a little bit ridiculous. But you know what else? He also seems pretty happy, you know? Gotta give him that. He has a job. The other guy doesn't have a job.
He's very satisfied in his position.
Right. That's clearly the lesson of Ashrei. V'ezu asher hasameach b'chelko. Right. That's the point is seeing the greatness in what you have, and he's really taking that to extreme, not just being like, right. I feel like we often think of what's being happy with what you have. It means, you know what? I wish I was rich, but I'm not, and that's okay. Rabbi Nachman saying, no, that's not Ezu Asher Sameach Bechelko. Sameach Bechelko means that you're really happy with what you have, that you're not saying, I wish it was different, but that you look at your portion in life and say, this is great. That I'm happy with this. Now, to your point, Natan, this is not a Maimonidean perspective. It is, on the one hand, it is an extreme. And I don't know, Rabbi Nachman has some pretty extreme perspectives, but I will tell you specifically that in the piece that I mentioned, Lukutei Moharan, which Rabbi Natan of Nemerov, who records this story as he heard it from Rabbi Nachman, that he links to this story. The Rabbi Nachman, without mentioning the Rambam, really goes after the Rambam. I don't think Rabbi Nachman was particularly impressed with the Rambam's emphasis on wisdom. And this can be seen as a critique of that philosophy, of the emphasis on wisdom per se. So you're 100% right on that. I don't know if the Rambam would be very happy about this. And it's important to be exposed to different perspectives. I would also say that I forgot about the point I wanted to make there. Aside from the lack of of admiration for this emphasis on philosophy, there's another critique here that you'll see, and that is of the people, I think, of his day and age, and where constant focus on speculation and thinking and learning and wisdom per se can lead you. And I think it is a social commentary, because what Rabbi Nachman, what I also think we are meant to see in the simple man is a certain emuna, a certain faith and contentment that we'll see further in the story. And that sometimes if we're not careful and we rely too much on our own intuition and own intelligence, it's hard to balance that with emuna, with a simple faith and reliance on God. And Rabbi Nachman, I think, sees what's happening to people in his generation who are very wise and might be described as very intelligent and learned, but are losing their faith and their emuna. So I don't think it's without reason that Rabbi Nachman has this sharp critique. Okay, we only have a little bit of time left. Let's go a little bit further. Anybody want to pick up from the clever man?
Can I just say
Yeah, make one point. Go for it.
I think Rabbi Nachman is appealing to many, many more people than Rambam is appealing to. Rambam is appealing to, say, the top 10%, and he is appealing to the bottom 50% or bottom 60%.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Beautiful, 100%. And you know, Charlie, we're running the money again. In that parallel piece, he again quotes the last pasuk in Kohelet. What are the last words of that pasuk, or the second to last pasuk? Ki zeh kol ha'adam. For that is all of humanity. Rabbi Nachman says, while only a select few can successfully achieve this wisdom in all areas and complex knowledge of God, everybody can have yirat shamayim, and everybody can keep the mitzvah. And that applies to everybody, not just the elites. So you're 100% on with that. Okay, let's go a little bit further with the clever man. Anybody want to take it?
I'll take it. You want me to do it?
Ralph wants it again. Go for it, Ralph.
In the meantime, there was a commotion. The clever man is traveling and coming home with great pomp and sophistication. The simple man also came running to greet him with great joy. He said to his wife, "Quick, give me quick the yuppah. I shall go and greet my dear friend. I will see him." She gave him the pelts, and he ran to greet him. Now the clever man was riding pompously in a horse-drawn carriage. The simple man came out to greet him and welcomed him joyously with great love. "My dear brother, how do you do? Blessed is God for bringing you and giving me the pleasure of seeing you." And the clever man, for whom the entire world was like nothing, as was stated above, that everyone and everything in the world was insignificant to him, for he considered himself above all the world, all the more so such a person as the Tom, who seems crazy. But nonetheless, on account of their shared childhood love, he drew him close and traveled with him into town. Now the two householders, the fathers of these two sons, had died during the time when the clever son was traveling the world. Their houses had been left as an inheritance. The simple son, who had remained local, moved into his father's house, claiming his inheritance. The clever son, however, had been in foreign countries and had no one to receive the house. So the clever man's house had no house to enter when he arrived. He traveled to an inn, but was anguished there because it wasn't up to his standards.
Okay, stop there for a second, because a thought just occurred to me. So you understand what happened, right? The clever man didn't inherit the house of his father because it went to ruins when he was away. The simple man simply moved into his father's house. So that there's some basic lesson in that. But what do you think the house also represents?
It represents security, stability,
Okay.
a place in the world.
Okay, a place in the world. What else?
And also his history, his whole history, his upbringing.
History, tradition, right? Tradition. Tradition, meeting, and this is, I haven't seen this, but it occurs to me that there's also a certain critique of people who travel the world. Maybe it's not literally traveling the world, but it's leaving the ghetto, exposing themselves to all these new ideas, and they find that they're too sophisticated for their father's house, or i.e., the traditions and history that was passed down to them. And it goes to them, it's in ruins, and they can't return to it. It seems not sophisticated enough for them. But the simple man seamlessly moves in to his father's house. The simple man is the one who carries on that tradition. Now, you maybe now is Rabbi Nachman saying you shouldn't ask questions, you should simply just carry on all the traditions? I'm not sure he's saying that, but I think he is making, again, just a very basic sociological comment about what often happens. You know, because while it's one thing to say, well, we of course we believe in questions, but when we think we're so worldly and sophisticated that the traditions are just not enough for us anymore, such that we can't even occupy our father's house.
The more you know, the less you understand.
And what do we even have? So I think there's a clear, again, sharp critique there. Right? Okay, let's go a little bit further. I think we have a few minutes left.
The simple man now found himself a new occupation. He would constantly run from his house to the clever man with love and joy. He noticed that the clever man was suffering from the lodgings. So the simple man said to the clever man, "Brother, come over to my house and stay with me. I will gather all my belongings into one bundle, and you'll have my entire house at your disposal." This was agreeable to the clever man, so he moved into his house and stayed with him. Now the clever man was always full of suffering, for he had left behind a reputation of being a wondrous sage, an artist, and a great doctor. A nobleman came and ordered him to make him a gold ring. He made him quite a wonderful ring and etched out engravings in the very amazing ways. He engraved it in it a tree that was a total marvel. The nobleman came, and the ring didn't please him at all. He had enormous suffering because he knew in himself that if this ring with the tree would be in Spain, it would be esteemed as an amazing work of art. And similarly, one time a great nobleman came and brought a rare, precious gem brought from distant lands. He also brought with him another gemstone with an engraved image and bid him to etch out that exact image onto the rare gemstone he had brought from distant lands. The Chacham precisely engraved that exact image, except he made a mistake in one thing, which nobody at all would discern except him alone. The nobleman came and took the gem, and he liked it very much. But the clever man had great agony from his mistake. As smart as I am, and this mistake should happen, oi. And similarly, in his decoding, he suffered as well. When he came to an ill person and he gave him treatments of which he knew clearly that if the patient would only survive, it would certainly have to be these treatments through which he had healed, for it was an excellent course of treatment. Then, however, the patient died. The public said that he died because of him, and he had huge suffering from this. Likewise, sometimes he gave an ill person treatments and the ill person became healthy, and the public said that it was a chance occurrence. So he was always filled with pain. Similarly, when he needed a garment, he summoned the tailor and took pains with him until he taught him to make the garment to his specifications, according to his knowledge of fashion. The tailor understood the directions and made the garment just as he wanted, except on one lapel he erred by not shaping it well. The Chacham suffered great anguish from that, because he knew in himself that although here it would be considered handsome, because no one would perceive the defect, but if I were to be in Spain with this lapel, I would be a laughingstock, and I would look like an imbecile. And he was full of suffering always. The simple man would joyously run over to the clever man all the time, but he always found him afflicted and full of suffering. He asked him, how could it be? A wise and wealthy person such as you, why do you always have anguish? Look, am I not constantly happy? This was a big joke in the eyes of the clever man. The Tom seemed crazy to him. The simple man said to him, even plain people, when they made fun of me, are fools as well. For if they are already smarter than me, they are first fools themselves, as mentioned above, all the more so such a clever person as you. So what if you are smarter than me? The simple man spoke up, saying to the clever man, may the one who gives grant that you should come up to my level and become a simple person. Oy. The clever man replied, is it possible that I could reach your level? If my intellect would be taken away, God spare us, or if I became sick, God forbid, I could also become insane. For what are you anyway but a madman? But that you would come up to my level? No way. It's completely impossible that you would become wise like me. The simple man answered, with Hashem Yisborach, everything is possible. It could happen in the blink of an eye that I ascend to your level of brilliance. And the clever man made great fun of him.
Okay, we'll pause here because we're running out of time. I know that was a lot. What do we make of that last point? I'm not sure how to take everything with it. What is the imagery of the engravings on the stones and the rings, etc.? That he does a good. There, it's interesting. There's a parallel.
He's so full of himself that he can't see the truth.
He can't enjoy anything.
That God can completely turn it the other way.
Right. I think on a very basic level, the critique here is that if one isn't careful, then their wisdom becomes itself the source of their foolishness, and vice versa. That sometimes it's to be simple is actually quite wise in a world that God controls and that God created. To be simple can be quite wise, to have that faith. And sometimes the wisdom can actually cause a lot of foolishness. And in the end of the story, that ends up what happens. The simple man becomes wiser, and the wise man ends up becoming foolish. And it's an inability to be happy. It's an ability to be content. So that I know we made to this part of the story. Let's pause here for now.